A black family, the Carters, move into the picturesque suburban town of Willowbrook, hoping for a fresh start. But beneath the neighborhood's manicured lawns and polite smiles lurks an unspoken tension. One longtime resident, Mrs. Pratt, is less than thrilled about their arrival. Determined to prove they belong, the Carters host a welcoming barbecue for their neighbors, but when an unexpected 911 call brings the police to their doorstep, the night takes a shocking turn. As the officers realize who they are dealing with, the entire neighborhood is forced to confront a hidden truth they can no longer ignore. What happened at the Carters' barbecue that turned a simple gathering into a moment of reckoning for the whole community? Let's find out. But before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you love powerful stories about community, resilience, and change, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. The moving truck pulled up to 318 Sycamore Drive just as the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet, tree-lined street. The Carter family had finally arrived at their new home, a beautiful two-story house with crisp white shutters and a wraparound porch. It was the kind of home Daniel and Michelle Carter had dreamed of for years, a place where they could raise their children, Ava and Jordan, in a safe, welcoming environment. Daniel, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a confident yet approachable presence, stepped out of the car first, taking in the sight before him. He had spent years working his way up the ranks in the fire department, and now, as the newly appointed fire chief of Willowbrook, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. This house, this town, it was supposed to be a fresh start. Michelle, ever the planner, had already begun making a mental checklist of everything they needed to do to make the house feel like home. As a high school principal, she understood the importance of first impressions. She knew that the sooner they integrated into the community, the better it would be for their children. "Come on, you two," she called to Ava and Jordan, who had just stepped out of the SUV. Ava, 14, was tall for her age and carried herself with an effortless grace that came from years of ballet training. She glanced up at the house with mild curiosity but kept her excitement contained. Moving wasn't easy for a teenager, and she had already decided that she would reserve judgment on their new town until she knew whether the kids at her new school were friendly. Jordan, 8 years old and full of boundless energy, had no such reservations. He ran ahead, practically bouncing up the steps of the porch. "This place is awesome," he exclaimed. "Do I get the big room?" Daniel chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "We'll see about that, buddy. First, let's get everything unloaded." As the movers began carrying furniture into the house, Michelle took a deep breath and surveyed their surroundings. The neighborhood was picturesque, straight out of a magazine, well-manicured lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, and houses that radiated charm and history. But as her gaze traveled down the street, she noticed a curtain fluttering in the window of the house directly across from theirs. Someone was watching them. Michelle turned her attention back to the task at hand, choosing to ignore the unsettling feeling in her gut. New places always took time to adjust to, and she wasn't going to let anything dampen their excitement. As the afternoon turned into evening, a few neighbors wandered over to introduce themselves. "Welcome to Willowbrook," said a woman in her early 50s, extending a warm handshake. "I'm Linda Patterson. My husband and I live just a few houses down." Michelle smiled, relieved to finally meet someone. "It's lovely to meet you, Linda. I'm Michelle, and this is my husband Daniel. Our kids, Ava and Jordan." Linda's husband, Tom, stepped forward and nodded at Daniel. "Fire chief, huh? We could use a man like you around here. Hope you like it in Willowbrook." Daniel nodded. "I think we will. It seems like a great community." "It is," Linda said, her smile widening. "Most of us have been here for years. We look out for each other." The words were meant to be reassuring, but Michelle couldn't help but sense an underlying message. There was an emphasis on we, as if to subtly remind them that they were new, outsiders in an already well-established circle. Still, she chose to brush it off, focusing on the positive. "Well, we're looking forward to settling in. Maybe we could host a small get-together soon? A chance to meet more of the neighborhood." Tom hesitated, his gaze shifting toward the house across the street. "That might be a good idea," he said slowly, "though not everyone in Willowbrook is as welcoming as we are." Michelle followed his gaze and saw an elderly woman standing stiffly on the porch of the house directly across from theirs. She wore a pale blue cardigan over a crisp white blouse, her silver hair neatly pinned back. Her arms were crossed, and even from a distance, Michelle could see the disapproving way she pursed her lips. "That's Mrs. Pratt," Linda said in a hushed tone. "She's lived here for decades. She's traditional." Traditional. It was a word that carried weight. Daniel exhaled slowly, exchanging a glance with Michelle. He had dealt with people like Mrs. Pratt before. Some people weren't openly hostile, but their disapproval was as clear as day. "Well," Michelle said, keeping her voice light, "I guess we'll just have to show her that we're good neighbors." Linda nodded, but her smile was strained. "Good luck with that." As the Pattersons walked back to their home, Michelle found her eyes drifting back toward Mrs. Pratt. The woman hadn't moved, her watchful gaze still locked on them. It was clear that she had already made up her mind about the Carters before even speaking to them. But Michelle refused to let that shake her. "Come on," Daniel said, placing a reassuring hand on her back. "Let's finish getting settled." Inside, the house was beginning to feel more like home. Boxes were slowly being unpacked, furniture was placed where it belonged, and the kids were already making plans for how they wanted their rooms decorated. Later that evening, as Michelle stood in the kitchen unpacking dishes, she heard the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. She turned just as Ava entered the room. "Mom," Ava said quietly. There was an envelope on the doorstep. Michelle dried her hands and took the envelope. It was a simple white envelope with no name, no return address. She hesitated for a moment before carefully opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Some people don't belong in Willowbrook. Consider this your warning." Michelle's breath caught in her throat. Daniel walked in at that moment, taking one look at her face and the note in her hand. "What's wrong?" Without a word, Michelle handed him the letter. His jaw clenched as he read it, his expression darkening. Ava shifted uncomfortably. "What does it mean?" Michelle forced a smile for her daughter's sake. "It means that not everyone is as welcoming as we'd hoped," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But that's not going to change anything. This is our home now." Daniel met her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They had worked too hard for this, sacrificed too much, to let fear drive them away. Outside, across the street, Mrs. Pratt stood at her window, watching. And for the first time, Michelle wondered just how far some people would go to make them feel unwelcome. The morning sun cast a soft glow over Sycamore Drive, illuminating the neatly trimmed lawns and polished mailboxes of Willowbrook. From an outsider's perspective, it was the perfect neighborhood, a place where families thrived, children played without fear, and everyone knew each other's names. But as Michelle Carter stepped out onto her porch, clutching the anonymous letter in her hand, she realized that perfection was just an illusion. She had barely slept the night before. While Daniel had tried to reassure her that the letter was nothing more than an empty threat, meant to intimidate rather than act, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone in the neighborhood wanted them gone. And worse, they were cowardly enough to hide behind anonymity to say it. "Good morning," Daniel called from the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. He was already dressed in his uniform, his fire chief badge glinting in the light. "You okay?" Michelle sighed and joined him at the kitchen island, sliding the letter across the counter. "I keep wondering if I should be taking this more seriously. What if this is just the beginning?" Daniel took a sip of his coffee, his face unreadable. "If it is, we'll handle it together." She appreciated his steady confidence, but deep down, she knew that being the new family in a neighborhood like Willowbrook came with unspoken challenges. And one of those challenges was currently standing across the street, peering out from behind lace curtains. Mrs. Eleanor Pratt. She was watching them again, just as she had the day before. Even from a distance, Michelle could feel the weight of the woman's disapproval pressing against her. "I don't think she's even tried to hide it," Michelle muttered. Daniel followed her gaze and shook his head. "She's made up her mind about us, that's for sure." "Yeah, but why?" "She doesn't even know us." "She doesn't want to know us," Daniel corrected. "Some people see change as a threat. We represent something she wasn't prepared for." Michelle exhaled slowly. "Well, I'm not going to let her, or anyone else, make us feel unwelcome in our own home." Daniel leaned over and kissed her forehead. "That's my girl." As he grabbed his keys, Jordan came bounding into the kitchen, stuffing his backpack with random items he didn't need for school. "Mom, do you think I can join the soccer team?" Michelle raised an eyebrow. "I thought you wanted to try out for baseball." "I changed my mind," he said with a grin. Besides, I already made a friend who plays soccer. His name's Benji. He's in my class. Michelle's heart warmed. That's great, sweetheart. I'll sign you up today. Jordan grabbed an apple from the counter and rushed toward the front door, barely slowing down to shout, "Bye, Dad." "Bye, Mom," before disappearing outside to meet the school bus. Ava, on the other hand, moved much slower. She came downstairs wearing her usual expression of teenage indifference, her earbuds securely in place as she grabbed a piece of toast and mumbled something that barely resembled a greeting. Michelle studied her daughter. "How are you feeling about school?" Ava shrugged. "It's fine. Did you meet anyone nice?" Ava hesitated for half a second before replying. "A couple of girls talked to me. But I don't know." Michelle didn't press. She knew Ava took longer to adjust to change than Jordan. Still, she hoped the transition would be smooth for her. "Just give it time," Michelle said gently. Ava gave her a small nod before heading out the door. Daniel turned to Michelle. "See? They're already adjusting." Michelle nodded, watching them go. "I hope so." That afternoon, Michelle made a point of walking over to the mailbox. Not because she was expecting anything important, but because she wanted to make sure no more anonymous letters had been left for them. She hesitated before opening the box, her heart beating a little too fast. But to her relief, all that was inside was a pile of regular mail, bills, a few welcome brochures, and an invitation to the Willowbrook Homeowners Association meeting. As she flipped through the papers, the sound of a throat clearing made her look up. Mrs. Pratt was standing at the edge of her driveway, hands clasped in front of her, lips pressed into a thin line. For a brief moment, Michelle considered ignoring her. But she had never been one to back down from a challenge. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pratt," she said, keeping her voice pleasant. The older woman didn't smile. "Mrs. Carter." There was a long silence before Mrs. Pratt spoke again. "I see your children have started school." "Yes," Michelle replied, refusing to let the woman's icy tone get under her skin. "They're settling in nicely." Mrs. Pratt gave a slow nod. "I imagine it must be different from where you came from." Michelle's smile didn't waver. "Every place has its own charm." Mrs. Pratt studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You'll find that Willowbrook has a way of keeping things as they should be." It wasn't a statement, it was a warning. Michelle's fingers tightened around the envelope in her hand, but she refused to let the woman see her rattle. "Well," she said lightly, "I guess we'll have to see if it changes us or if we change it." Mrs. Pratt's eyes narrowed slightly before she turned and walked back toward her house, her posture stiff with disapproval. As Michelle watched her disappear behind her front door, she let out a slow breath. The battle lines had been drawn, even if no one had explicitly stated it. But Michelle had made up her mind. They were here to stay. Later that evening, as she and Daniel sat on the couch, she handed him the invitation to the homeowners meeting. "We should go," she said. Daniel skimmed the paper. "Are you sure? If we're going to be part of this community, then we need to show up." Daniel nodded. "Then we'll be there." As they sat in comfortable silence, Michelle found herself looking out the window toward Mrs. Pratt's house. The woman may have spent decades shaping Willowbrook in her image, but change had arrived on Sycamore Drive. And Michelle was ready for whatever came next. The week passed with a mixture of routine and unspoken tension. The Carter family settled into their new home as best as they could, unpacking the last of their boxes, adjusting to new schedules, and slowly familiarizing themselves with life in Willowbrook. For the most part, their neighbors remained polite, but distant. The greetings were there, quick nods, brief waves from across the street, but few conversations extended beyond surface pleasantries. Michelle noticed how some neighbors would walk their dogs a little faster when passing their house, or how casual chats among longtime residents would hush slightly when she approached. She wasn't naive. She knew what this was. The welcome the Carters had received wasn't exactly hostile, but it wasn't warm either. There was a silent message beneath the pleasantries: "You don't belong here." But Michelle had never been one to back down in the face of resistance. She believed in persistence, in meeting tension with kindness. And that's why she made the decision that weekend. They would host a neighborhood barbecue. Michelle sat at the dining table, typing away on her laptop as she designed the invitations. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as Daniel walked in, stretching after an early morning workout. "What's this?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. "A friendly neighborhood invitation," Michelle replied, clicking print. Daniel arched an eyebrow as the first few invitations rolled out of the printer. A barbecue? You're really going all in, huh? We need to meet these people properly, Michelle said, gathering the papers. They need to see that we're not going anywhere. What better way than with good food and a friendly get-together? Daniel smirked. You do realize some of them will find an excuse not to come, right? She shrugged. That's fine. But they can't say we didn't try. Daniel kissed the top of her head. I love that stubbornness of yours. Later that afternoon, Michelle, Ava, and Jordan set out to deliver the invitations. Some neighbors accepted them with genuine smiles. Oh, that sounds lovely, said Linda Patterson, the only neighbor who had shown them any warmth since they arrived. I'll bring a pie. Others were more hesitant. Saturday, you said? A man named Mr. Dean scratched his chin. I'll have to check with my wife. We may have plans. And then there were the rejections that weren't outright refusals but were dismissive nonetheless. That's very thoughtful of you, said a middle-aged woman who lived 3 doors down. We'll see if we can make it. But the tightness in her smile made it clear she had no intention of coming. Still, Michelle kept her composure, offering the same warmth to everyone. Then came the final house on her route. Mrs. Eleanor Pratt's. She stood on her porch, watching them approach with her usual cold stare, as if she had been expecting them. Michelle kept her smile steady. Good afternoon, Mrs. Pratt. Mrs. Pratt didn't return the greeting. What do you need, Mrs. Carter? Michelle held out the invitation. We're hosting a neighborhood barbecue on Saturday. A chance for everyone to get together and enjoy some good food. Mrs. Pratt's eyes flickered to the paper, but she made no move to take it. I see. You're more than welcome to join us, Michelle added, refusing to be put off by the woman's frosty demeanor. Mrs. Pratt's lips pressed into a thin line. We'll see. Michelle held the invitation out for another second before finally setting it on the porch railing. Hope to see you there. With that, she turned, motioning for Ava and Jordan to follow her back home. Behind them, Mrs. Pratt remained where she was, her eyes lingering on the invitation but making no effort to pick it up. The day of the barbecue arrived with clear skies and warm weather. Daniel manned the grill, flipping burgers and marinated chicken as the delicious smell filled the air. Ava and Jordan helped set up a table with side dishes, potato salad, grilled corn, homemade lemonade. Music played softly from a speaker, and a few kids from the neighborhood had already started playing a game of tag on the lawn. And, to Michelle's relief, some of their neighbors actually showed up. Linda Patterson arrived first, carrying a homemade apple pie. This looks wonderful, she said, looking around. You really know how to make a place feel inviting. Slowly, others followed, some coming out of curiosity, others because they didn't want to seem impolite. Conversation started, albeit a little stiff at first, but as the evening progressed, the laughter grew louder and the atmosphere lightened. Michelle stood by the drink table, watching it unfold, feeling something shift in the air. And then, she saw her. Mrs. Pratt. She wasn't joining in. But she was watching. From her front porch, arms crossed, her face unreadable. She was standing there, unmoving, just as she had the day they moved in. For a brief moment, Michelle thought she might walk over. But instead, the elderly woman turned and walked back inside her house, closing the door behind her. Michelle exhaled, unsurprised. But she had tried. And that mattered. As the sun began to set, the barbecue was still going strong. More neighbors had joined as word spread, and by now, the gathering felt less like a forced event and more like a genuine community get-together. Daniel walked up beside Michelle, handing her a plate of grilled chicken. You did good, he said. Michelle smiled. I think so. She glanced at Mrs. Pratt's house one last time. She wasn't naive enough to think one barbecue would change everything. But it was a start. The evening air buzzed with conversation and laughter as more neighbors warmed up to the atmosphere of the barbecue. What had started as a hesitant gathering had turned into a lively neighborhood event. Daniel stood by the grill, expertly flipping burgers and ribs, while Michelle moved between groups, chatting and ensuring everyone had enough to eat. Ava and Jordan were playing with the other kids, their carefree giggles floating through the air. For the first time since moving to Willowbrook, Michelle felt something close to belonging. Then, she noticed it. A ripple in the atmosphere. A subtle shift in energy. Conversations quieted as some neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. People who had been enjoying themselves just moments ago suddenly looked unsure. Michelle followed their gazes and saw the reason why. A police cruiser was pulling up in front of their house. Her stomach tightened. Daniel, sensing the change, wiped his hands on a towel and moved toward her. "Stay calm," he murmured. "Let's see what this is about." Two officers stepped out of the vehicle. One was a tall man with a sturdy build, his name tag reading Officer Reed. The other, Officer Simmons, was younger, fresh-faced, and visibly uncomfortable. The music had been turned down, and the conversations had ceased. Every eye was on them. "Good evening," Officer Reed said, his voice neutral. "We received a complaint about a disturbance, loud music, possible trespassing." Michelle's breath hitched, but she forced herself to stay composed. "Disturbance?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm. "This is a neighborhood barbecue. Everyone here is invited." Officer Reed gave a stiff nod. "Would you mind if we took a look around?" Daniel exhaled, stepping aside. "You're welcome to, but you won't find anything out of order." The two officers scanned the gathering, their eyes flicking over the neatly set tables, the grill, the groups of neighbors standing together. The atmosphere was warm, friendly, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. Michelle glanced at her guests, noting the way some of them shuffled awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. A few of them were whispering, likely already putting together what had happened. Then she saw it. Across the street, behind the lace curtains, Mrs. Pratt, standing in her usual spot, her watchful gaze locked onto them, her face expressionless. Michelle's jaw clenched. She had no proof, but she knew. She knew. The officers exchanged glances before Officer Reed sighed and relaxed his posture. "Everything looks fine here," he admitted. "Sorry for the inconvenience, Chief Carter." Daniel gave a curt nod, not bothering to correct the use of his title. "No problem, officer." But Michelle knew it was a problem. It wasn't about noise. It wasn't about a disturbance. It was about them. As the officers turned to leave, Michelle saw the way some neighbors avoided looking at her, how a few people awkwardly excused themselves from the gathering. The unspoken reality was clear: they had been tested. And while the officers had left, the damage had already been done. The party carried on, but the atmosphere was different. Some stayed, wanting to show their support, but others drifted away, not wanting to be caught in the middle of whatever battle was silently brewing. Daniel sat beside Michelle on the porch steps, handing her a glass of lemonade. "You okay?" Michelle stared into the cup, then at the dwindling crowd. "We did everything right, Daniel. We invited everyone, we followed the rules, we were good neighbors." Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know." She glanced back toward Mrs. Pratt's house. "And yet someone, we know who, thought we didn't belong enough to call the police on us." Daniel's jaw tightened. "They wanted to humiliate us. Scare us into feeling like we're outsiders." Michelle exhaled, shaking her head. "Well, it's not going to work." He gave her a small, proud smile. "Damn right it won't." Ava approached, her arms folded, her face stormy. "That was messed up." Jordan, standing beside her, nodded solemnly. "Why did the police come, Dad? We weren't doing anything bad." Daniel sighed and patted the step next to him. "Come sit down, bud." Jordan hesitated before sitting, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. Daniel met his son's curious, slightly confused eyes. "Sometimes, people feel uncomfortable when things change," he explained gently. "And when they feel uncomfortable, they look for ways to push back, even if there's no real reason." Jordan frowned. "But that's not fair." Michelle swallowed the lump in her throat. "No, sweetheart. It's not." Ava's expression darkened. "So, what? Are we just supposed to pretend this didn't happen?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "But we also don't let it break us. We stay. We thrive. And we prove that we belong, because we do." Ava's shoulders loosened slightly, but the fire in her eyes remained. "I still think it's messed up." Michelle reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "It is. But this isn't over." And it wasn't. That night, as the last of their guests left, Michelle found herself standing in the driveway, looking up at Mrs. Pratt's house. The curtains were drawn now, but she knew the old woman was still watching. Watching and waiting. Michelle took a slow breath, then turned and walked back inside. Tomorrow was a new day. And this fight was just beginning. The morning after the barbecue, Michelle woke up with a heavy heart. The previous night had left a bitter taste in her mouth. The way the police had shown up, not because of an actual disturbance, but because someone had wanted to send a message, still gnawed at her. She had gone to bed replaying the scene over and over in her mind, feeling the weight of every hesitant glance and hushed whisper from the neighbors who had witnessed it. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the fact that someone had called the police on them for no reason, or the fact that some of their neighbors had acted as if it was nothing. Lying beside her, Daniel was already awake, staring at the ceiling in quiet contemplation. He had spent years as a firefighter, serving communities, saving lives. He had seen people at their most vulnerable and had always treated them with kindness and respect. Yet here they were, facing judgment simply for existing in their own home. "You okay?" Michelle whispered. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Not really." She turned on her side, tracing the shape of his hand with her fingertips. "You think this is just the beginning?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know one thing, we're not going anywhere." Michelle nodded. "Good. Because I don't plan on backing down either." By mid-morning, word of the barbecue incident had spread throughout Willowbrook. Michelle noticed it when she took Jordan for a walk down the street. Some neighbors waved, some simply nodded, and others barely acknowledged her at all. She could feel the tension lingering in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Then there were the people who did acknowledge her. "Michelle, hi." Linda Patterson called from her driveway. Michelle paused, grateful for a friendly face. "Morning, Linda." Linda hesitated before lowering her voice. "Listen, I just want to say, what happened last night was awful. I know that wasn't right." Michelle's chest tightened. "Thanks, Linda. But you don't have to apologize for your neighbors." "I know," Linda sighed, glancing toward Mrs. Pratt's house. "But some of them, well, they've lived here for decades, and they don't like change. That doesn't excuse it, though." Michelle forced a small smile. "We're just trying to live our lives like anyone else." Linda nodded. "And you should. If you ever need anything, let me know." As Michelle and Jordan continued walking, she heard whispers from an elderly couple sitting on their porch. "They're good people," the woman muttered to her husband. "You can't just call the police on someone for having a barbecue." The man grumbled in response. "Tell that to Eleanor. She still thinks it's 1960. Michelle kept walking, pretending not to hear. But inside, a mix of emotions swirled within her. There were people in Willowbrook who saw what was happening, who knew that what had been done to her family was wrong. But how many of them would actually stand up against it? Underscore 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 underscore. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived home from work earlier than expected. "I just got a call from the police station," he said, setting his keys on the counter. Michelle tensed. "What? Why? They wanted to apologize." Michelle blinked. "Apologize?" Daniel nodded. "The chief heard about what happened. Apparently, some of the officers weren't happy that they were sent out for a call that never should have been made in the first place. Word got around." Michelle folded her arms. "So, what are they going to do about it?" Daniel sighed. "Nothing. They understand our frustration, but technically, a noise complaint is a noise complaint." Michelle scoffed. "That's convenient." Daniel reached for her hand. "It's frustrating, I know. But if nothing else, at least some people are paying attention. Not everyone is on Mrs. Pratt's side." Michelle leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. "I just don't understand people like her, Daniel. What does she gain from trying to push us out?" Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "For people like her, it's not about gaining something. It's about keeping something." Michelle swallowed hard. She had seen this before, growing up in a town where her family had to fight for respect despite doing everything right. Now, as a wife and mother, she was dealing with the same battle all over again. That evening, the Carters were sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. Michelle exchanged a glance with Daniel before standing up. Through the peephole, she saw a familiar face, Officer Simmons, the younger officer from the night before. Taking a breath, she opened the door. "Officer Simmons." "Mrs. Carter," he greeted with a nervous smile. I wanted to drop this off." He handed her a small envelope. She took it cautiously. "What is it?" A written apology, he said. From the station. But also from me. Michelle studied his face. He looked young, early 20s, maybe. His expression was sincere. I wasn't comfortable with how things went down last night, he admitted. I knew the moment we pulled up that it wasn't a real disturbance. I didn't know what to do in the moment. I felt like I had to follow orders. Michelle felt some of her anger soften. And now, Simmons said, rubbing the back of his neck, I just want you to know that some of us don't agree with this kind of thing. And I hope you and your family don't feel like the entire town is against you. Michelle took a slow breath, then nodded. Thank you, Officer Simmons. That means something. The young officer gave her a small, apologetic nod before stepping back. I should go. But, if you ever need anything, I want you to know you can call me. She watched him leave, then closed the door. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What was that about? Michelle handed him the envelope. An apology. Daniel opened it and read the note inside. Well, that's unexpected. Michelle exhaled. Maybe. She looked out the window, her gaze drifting toward Mrs. Pratt's house once again. Or maybe it means something is starting to change. Daniel followed her gaze. You think Mrs. Pratt is paying attention? I think she's realizing that not everyone is on her side, Michelle murmured. Daniel smiled. Good. Let's keep it that way. That night, as Michelle lay in bed, she thought about everything that had happened over the past few days. Yes, Mrs. Pratt had tried to humiliate them. Yes, some of their neighbors had turned away. But there were also people standing with them. People who saw what was happening and didn't agree with it. Maybe, just maybe, Willowbrook wasn't as unshakable as Mrs. Pratt wanted it to be. And Michelle planned to make sure of it. The days following the barbecue incident passed in a blur, but the undercurrents of tension remained in Willowbrook. The police visit had left a mark, one that people weren't openly discussing, but Michelle could feel its effects in every interaction she had. At the grocery store, a woman she had previously greeted warmly now only offered her a tight smile before quickly turning away. At the coffee shop, a conversation between two neighbors fell silent the moment Michelle walked in. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't outright rejection. It was avoidance. It was people knowing that what had happened was wrong, but refusing to acknowledge it. Daniel, as usual, took it in stride, brushing off the tension with his usual quiet resilience. They don't know how to handle it, he said one evening as he set down his book. Some of them probably feel guilty but don't want to admit they stood by and let it happen. Michelle exhaled. So, what do we do? Just ignore it? No, Daniel leaned forward, his eyes steady. We show them that we're not going anywhere. We keep showing up, being involved, being good neighbors. And eventually, they'll have to deal with the fact that we belong here just as much as they do. Michelle nodded, taking his words to heart. And so, that week, she made a decision. She wasn't going to shrink away. She was going to integrate, whether people liked it or not. The next day, Michelle took the first step by stopping by the school to meet with the principal. Since their move, she had yet to formally introduce herself beyond filling out enrollment paperwork. And as a fellow educator, she knew that being active in the school community was one of the best ways to forge connections. She stepped into the administrative office, greeted by the receptionist, a warm woman in her late 40s named Ms. Reynolds. Good morning, Mrs. Carter, she said with a smile. Principal Hanson is expecting you. Michelle nodded in thanks and was led into an office where Principal Hanson, a sharp-looking man in his early 50s, stood to greet her. Mrs. Carter, he said, extending his hand. It's great to finally meet you in person. Michelle shook his hand. Likewise, Principal Hanson. I just wanted to formally introduce myself and see how Ava and Jordan are settling in. He smiled. From what I hear, they're both doing well. Jordan seems to be making friends quickly. And Ava, well, he hesitated. Michelle's heart sank slightly. What about Ava? Hanson sighed. She's a great student, sharp, respectful, but she keeps to herself. She doesn't seem very interested in getting involved in school activities yet. Michelle nodded. She's still adjusting. I understand, Hanson said. New schools can be tough, especially at her age. I'll talk to her, Michelle promised. Encourage her to open up. As she stood to leave, Hanson added, we'd love to have more parents involved in school events. If you're interested, we have a volunteer program. Michelle smiled. I'd love to help in any way I can. Hanson's expression faltered for half a second, as if he hadn't expected that answer. But then he nodded. That's great. I'll have Ms. Reynolds send you the details. Michelle left the school feeling a small sense of victory. It wasn't much, but it was something. One step forward. That evening, as Michelle prepared dinner, Ava sat at the counter scrolling through her phone. How was school today? Michelle asked, chopping vegetables. Ava shrugged. Fine. Did you talk to anyone new? Ava hesitated. A few people? Michelle paused. Ava sighed, setting her phone down. Look, I know you want me to jump into things, but it's not that easy. People are nice, but they're also watching. Michelle frowned. Watching? Like they don't know what to make of me yet. Ava sighed, stirring her juice with her straw. I can feel it, Mom. They're trying to figure out if I fit in here. Michelle's heart clenched. She had felt that same scrutiny from the adults in the neighborhood. And now, Ava was feeling it too. You don't have to force anything, Michelle said gently. But don't let their hesitation keep you from being yourself. Ava gave a small nod but didn't look convinced. Michelle reached out and squeezed her hand. Give it time, sweetheart. That weekend, Michelle made another effort to connect with the community. She and Daniel attended the Willowbrook Homeowners Association meeting. It was held at the community center, a quaint brick building that had likely stood for decades. As they walked in, the room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, business owners, and longtime residents. And, of course, Mrs. Pratt. She sat in the front row, her posture stiff, her lips pursed in that same expression of quiet disapproval. Michelle took a deep breath. We belong here, too. The meeting began with routine discussions, neighborhood maintenance, upcoming events, minor disputes about property lines. It was all normal. Too normal. Then, someone brought up the barbecue incident. I heard the police were called over a noise complaint last weekend, said a middle-aged man near the back. Murmurs rippled through the room. Daniel spoke up. Yes. That was our barbecue. The officers came, saw there was nothing wrong, and left. Some people nodded, seeming satisfied with that explanation. Others exchanged awkward glances. And then, Mrs. Pratt cleared her throat. I just think, she said slowly, that we should all be mindful of maintaining the peaceful environment that Willowbrook has always been known for. Silence. A few people nodded. Michelle clenched her jaw, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the room. With all due respect, Eleanor, said Mr. Caldwell, an older gentleman sitting a few rows back, the Carters were just having a barbecue. Plenty of us have done the same. More murmurs. A shift. Mrs. Pratt's lips thinned. The point is, Caldwell continued, they're our neighbors now. We should be treating them as such. Michelle met his gaze. He gave her a small nod. A tiny victory. But Mrs. Pratt wasn't done. Of course, she said, offering a tight smile. All I'm saying is that Willowbrook has always had a certain standard. Michelle's stomach tightened. There it was. The unspoken rule. The underlying us versus them. She lifted her chin. And we intend to meet that standard. Just as every other family here does. A beat of silence. Then, a few murmurs of agreement. Mrs. Pratt didn't reply. And for the first time since moving in, Michelle saw something in the woman's face. Not anger. Not disapproval. But realization. Change had arrived in Willowbrook. The tension from the Homeowners Association meeting lingered long after Michelle and Daniel returned home. The way Mrs. Pratt had carefully chosen her words, certain standard, still echoed in Michelle's mind. It was the same coded language she had heard in other places, in other communities that had drawn invisible lines between who belonged and who did not. But she had also seen something else that night. For the first time, Mrs. Pratt had been challenged. Mr. Caldwell's words had shifted the dynamic, and though the meeting had ended without further confrontation, Michelle could feel that something had cracked in the foundation of Willowbrook's exclusivity. Now, the real question was how deep that crack would run. The next morning, Michelle sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as she scrolled through her emails. She had just opened one from the school volunteer program when Daniel walked in, his expression unreadable. What is it? She asked, setting her mug down. He exhaled, rubbing his hand over the back of his neck. I got a call from one of the fire captains this morning. Michelle frowned. Something wrong? Daniel hesitated. Not exactly. But I heard from one of the guys that some people in town are concerned about my position as fire chief. Michelle straightened. Concerned. Daniel nodded. They think I might not understand Willowbrook's way of doing things. She clenched her jaw. Let me guess, Mrs. Pratt and her little circle. Daniel shrugged. Could be. But it's not just her. There are people who think leadership should stay with established members of the community. Michelle shook her head. So, they're basically saying you don't deserve the job because we're new here. Pretty much. Her hands curled into fists. That's ridiculous. You've spent years serving as a firefighter. You earned that position. Daniel gave her a small smile. I know. And I'm not going anywhere. Michelle exhaled, trying to calm the anger bubbling inside her. They really don't like change, do they? No, Daniel said. And now they're realizing they can't stop it. Michelle reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Then we keep going. We keep showing up. Daniel nodded. Absolutely. That afternoon, Michelle took another step forward. She had signed up for the school's parent-teacher committee, determined to play an active role in the school community. If people were going to try to push her family out, she would make herself impossible to ignore. As she walked into the school's meeting room, she was greeted with a mix of polite smiles and hesitant glances. The committee chair, a woman named Deborah Fields, gestured toward an empty seat. Michelle, glad you could join us. Michelle took her seat, nodding at the other parents. Glad to be here. The meeting started with general discussions about upcoming school events, fundraising plans, and volunteer opportunities. Michelle listened carefully, waiting for the right moment to contribute. Then, an opportunity presented itself. We're still looking for someone to oversee the planning of this year's spring carnival, Deborah said, flipping through her notes. Any volunteers? A long pause. A few people shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Michelle raised her hand. I'd be happy to help organize it, she said. Deborah blinked in surprise. Really? Michelle nodded. Yes. I have experience coordinating school events from my previous district. The room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, Deborah smiled. That's great. We could use the help. A few parents exchanged uncertain glances, but no one objected. Michelle had just claimed a seat at the table. Later that evening, Michelle sat on the porch, watching as the sun dipped below the rooftops of Willowbrook. The sound of the screen door opening signaled Daniel's arrival. He took a seat beside her, handing her a glass of iced tea. How was the meeting? He asked. Michelle took a sip. I volunteered to run the spring carnival. Daniel chuckled. Of course, you did. She smiled. I figured if people are going to keep questioning whether we belong, I might as well make myself indispensable. Daniel nodded approvingly. That's my wife. She exhaled, staring across the street at Mrs. Pratt's house. You think she's watching? Daniel followed her gaze. Probably. Michelle set her glass down. Good. She wasn't backing down. Michelle had always believed in the power of persistence. If she showed up, if she contributed, if she remained consistent, people would have no choice but to accept her presence. But in Willowbrook, she was learning that resistance didn't always come in the form of direct confrontation. Sometimes, it was silence. The morning after the parent-teacher committee meeting, Michelle stopped by the local coffee shop to pick up breakfast. As she stepped inside, she immediately felt the shift in the room. A group of women, several of whom she recognized from the PTA, sat at a round table near the counter, their conversation lively and animated. But the moment Michelle approached the counter, the laughter dulled. The talking softened. They saw her. They knew she was there. But they didn't acknowledge her. Michelle held her head high, stepping forward to place her order. 1 cappuccino and 2 blueberry muffins, please. The barista, a young woman with a friendly smile, nodded. Coming right up. Michelle could still feel the group's eyes on her. She turned, meeting the gaze of one of the women, Karen Middleton, a well-known voice in the PTA. Michelle had seen her at the meeting, nodding along as she volunteered to coordinate the spring carnival. Now, Karen was staring at her as if Michelle had disrupted the natural order of things. Michelle smiled. Morning, Karen. Karen's lips barely moved. Morning. That was it. No warmth, no interest, just a simple, clipped greeting. And when Michelle didn't look away, Karen turned back to her group, as if dismissing her entirely. It was a small moment, but Michelle understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about being openly hostile. This was about exclusion. About making her presence in their space feel unwelcome without ever saying the words aloud. A silent battle. One Michelle refused to lose. By the time Michelle returned home, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let them push her to the sidelines. She wasn't going to shrink herself just because a few people in the community were uncomfortable. If they wanted to act like she didn't belong, then she would prove them wrong, by refusing to fade into the background. Over the next few days, Michelle threw herself into organizing the spring carnival. She met with vendors, coordinated schedules, and sent out sign-up sheets for volunteers. She made sure her name was on every email, that her presence was known at every meeting. Slowly but surely, she started to make progress. A few parents reached out, offering to help. Some teachers expressed excitement about the event. Even Principal Hanson, who had seemed hesitant at first, began responding to her emails with enthusiasm. And yet, despite all of this, Michelle knew that not everyone was thrilled about her involvement. Her first real proof came when she stopped by the school one afternoon to drop off paperwork. She walked into the front office, only to overhear two women talking in hushed voices just beyond the receptionist's desk. "She just got here," one of them said. "And now she's running one of the biggest events of the year?" "I know," the other responded. "It's like she's trying to take over." Michelle's steps faltered. She wasn't supposed to hear that. The voices belonged to Karen Middleton and Rebecca Langley, two of the most influential women on the PTA. Instead of confronting them, Michelle stepped forward, letting her presence be known. The two women turned abruptly, their faces flashing with guilt before quickly masking it with polite smiles. "Michelle," Karen said smoothly. "Didn't see you there." Michelle offered them a tight-lipped smile. Apparently not. She didn't address what she had overheard. She didn't need to. She just handed her paperwork to the receptionist and walked out without another word. Because she knew something they didn't. They could whisper all they wanted. They could exclude her from their conversations. But the more they tried to push her away, the more determined she became. This wasn't just about a school event. This was about making space for herself in a community that wanted to keep her at arm's length. And Michelle Carter had never been one to back down from a fight. That evening, as she sat on the porch with Daniel, she told him what had happened. "They're scared," Daniel said simply. Michelle frowned. "Scared?" He nodded. "People like that, people like Karen and Rebecca, they're used to controlling things. They don't like feeling like they're losing that control. And that's exactly what's happening." Michelle exhaled, staring out at the street. Across from them, Mrs. Pratt's curtains were drawn, but Michelle knew the woman was likely watching. "They're going to keep pushing back," Michelle murmured. Daniel shrugged. "Then we push harder." Michelle smiled. "I like the way you think." The next day, Michelle showed up to the PTA volunteer orientation wearing her best blazer, carrying a stack of folders, and ready to make herself impossible to ignore. She was here to stay. And whether the community liked it or not, they were going to have to deal with it. The days leading up to the spring carnival felt like a quiet war. Michelle had made progress, securing vendors, organizing volunteers, finalizing activities, but there was still resistance. Karen Middleton and Rebecca Langley weren't outright opposing her, but their actions spoke louder than words. They were subtly undermining her, going behind her back to make changes, accidentally forgetting to include her in key decisions, and questioning her leadership in small, condescending ways. Michelle ignored most of it. She refused to let their pettiness derail her. But then, things escalated. It started with a simple task, distributing promotional flyers for the spring carnival. Michelle had printed 500 flyers, ensuring they were professionally designed and eye-catching. The plan was to distribute them to schools, community centers, and local businesses. She had given Karen and Rebecca a box of flyers to handle one area while she and a few other volunteers covered another. Except, the next morning, when Michelle stopped by one of the coffee shops where the flyers were supposed to be displayed, she found nothing. Not a single flyer. Confused, she checked another location. And another. Same result. By the time she got back to the school, she was furious. She found Karen and Rebecca chatting near the teacher's lounge and wasted no time. "Where are the flyers?" Michelle demanded. Karen blinked. "What? The flyers I gave you," Michelle said sharply. "You were supposed to distribute them yesterday. I just checked multiple locations. Not one had a flyer." Rebecca glanced at Karen, shifting uncomfortably. We. Karen quickly composed herself, offering a small, practiced smile. We must have misplaced them. Michelle crossed her arms. Misplaced 500 flyers? Karen shrugged. It was a lot of work. Maybe they got left behind somewhere. Michelle clenched her jaw. So, let me get this straight. The one thing I asked you both to handle, something that should have been simple, you just forgot. Rebecca let out an awkward laugh. Mistakes happen. Michelle inhaled deeply, steadying herself. I don't believe this was a mistake. Karen's expression turned icy. Are you accusing us of something, Michelle? Michelle met her gaze head-on. I'm saying it's funny how things keep getting forgotten or misplaced when I'm the one in charge of them. Karen let out a breathy laugh. You're being dramatic. Michelle tilted her head. Am I? A tense silence stretched between them. Then Karen shrugged. You're new here, Michelle. Maybe things just work a little differently in Willowbrook than what you're used to. And there it was. The quiet reminder that she was still an outsider. That they would always see her as an intruder. Michelle felt a sharp pang of anger in her chest. But she refused to let it show. Instead, she smiled. Well, she said smoothly, I guess I'll just have to print another 500 flyers. And this time, I'll handle it myself. Karen's lips twitched. Michelle turned on her heel and walked away, her heart pounding. Michelle let her words sit for a moment before finally saying, Now, if there are no further concerns, we'll move forward as planned. No one else spoke. Even Karen stayed quiet. Michelle turned back to her notes, knowing she had just won another battle. That night, as she and Daniel sat on the porch, she replayed the meeting in her mind. They're getting desperate, she said, sipping her tea. Daniel smirked. That's because they're losing. Michelle sighed, staring across the street at Mrs. Pratt's house. The woman had been eerily quiet lately. She still watched, still listened. But she hadn't made a move since the homeowners' meeting. I can feel something coming, Michelle murmured. Daniel's smirk faded. What do you mean? Michelle exhaled. I don't know. Just a feeling. A community divided never stayed silent for long. Something was going to give. She just didn't know when. The morning of the spring carnival arrived with clear skies and the scent of fresh-cut grass. It should have been a perfect day. But Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had spent the past week preparing, double-checking every detail, ensuring that nothing went wrong. But she had learned something in Willowbrook: resistance doesn't always come head-on. Sometimes, it waits for the perfect moment to strike. And today felt like that moment. By mid-morning, vendors began arriving, setting up food stands, game booths, and activity stations in the school's courtyard. Volunteers bustled around, hanging decorations, setting up tables, and checking last-minute logistics. Michelle was everywhere, coordinating, answering questions, making sure everything ran smoothly. And then, it happened. Karen and Rebecca approached her, both wearing suspiciously polite smiles. Michelle, Karen said, her voice dripping with fake concern. We have a little problem. Michelle knew it. She knew they would try something. She folded her arms. What is it? Rebecca sighed dramatically. There seems to be a mix-up with the permits for the food vendors. Michelle's stomach dropped. What mix-up? She asked carefully. Karen handed her a document. The school board only approved 3 vendors, but you booked 5. And since not all of them were officially cleared, 2 will have to leave. Michelle's fingers tightened around the paper. This wasn't a mistake. This was sabotage. She had submitted every vendor's paperwork weeks ago. She had receipts. But now, 2 vendors were being forced out. And she already knew which ones. Flipping through the paperwork, her suspicions were confirmed. The 2 vendors being rejected? The only 2 black-owned businesses at the carnival. Michelle looked up slowly. You've got to be kidding me. Karen put a hand over her heart, feigning sympathy. I'm so sorry. It's just the rules. Michelle's blood boiled. She glanced around. Parents were arriving. Kids were already playing. The carnival was starting. If she made a scene now, they would win. Because that's what they wanted, for her to react. To explode. To prove them right. So instead, Michelle took a deep breath. And smiled. I see, she said calmly. Karen's eyes flickered with surprise. She had expected anger, not composure. Michelle turned to one of the volunteers. "Can you get me Principal Hanson?" Minutes later, Principal Hanson arrived, looking slightly out of breath. "What's going on?" he asked. Michelle handed him the same document Karen had given her. "Apparently, 2 of our vendors didn't get approval." Hanson frowned. "That doesn't make sense. I signed off on all 5. Karen froze. Michelle suppressed a smirk. Rebecca cleared her throat. "Well, there must have been." Hanson raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'll handle this," he said, giving Karen a sharp look. He stepped aside, pulling out his phone. Michelle watched as he made a single call. And just like that, the mix-up was resolved. All 5 vendors were approved. Karen's face was priceless. Rebecca looked like she wanted to sink into the ground. Hanson turned back to Michelle. "Sorry for the confusion." Michelle smiled. "No problem at all." She turned back to Karen and Rebecca. "Anything else I should know about?" Neither woman said a word. "Didn't think so." And with that, Michelle walked away. They had lost. Again. Later that afternoon, as the carnival buzzed with energy and excitement, Michelle finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She stood near the main game booths, watching Jordan and Ava play ring toss with their friends. Despite everything, the event had turned out perfectly. And then, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "I suppose I owe you an apology." Michelle turned, and stilled. "Mrs. Pratt." The old woman stood beside her, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Michelle thought she had imagined it. "Mrs. Pratt? Apologizing?" Michelle raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Mrs. Pratt inhaled deeply, staring out at the carnival. "For assuming you wouldn't last here." Michelle studied her carefully. Mrs. Pratt wasn't warm. She wasn't smiling. But there was something different in her posture. Less hostility. Less resistance. "I've lived in Willowbrook for 42 years, Mrs. Pratt said. And in all that time, I've seen a lot of people come and go. People who didn't fit in." Michelle folded her arms. "And you thought we'd be one of them?" Mrs. Pratt nodded. Michelle shook her head. "We're not going anywhere. I can see that." A long pause. Then, Mrs. Pratt looked at her, her gaze sharper now. "You're stubborn." Michelle smirked. "So are you." The old woman actually chuckled. Then, with one last glance at the carnival, she muttered, "Well, I suppose there are worse things than change." And then, without another word, Mrs. Pratt walked away. Michelle stood there, processing what had just happened. Had she just won Mrs. Pratt over? She let out a breath, shaking her head with a smile. Maybe she hadn't completely won. But she had cracked something. And for now, that was enough. The spring carnival was a success. Children raced from booth to booth, their laughter echoing through the school grounds. Families sat at picnic tables, enjoying fresh food from the vendors. The air smelled of funnel cakes, popcorn, and grilled meats, a perfect blend of community and joy. But Michelle wasn't just enjoying the carnival. She was observing. Noticing the shift. The same parents who had hesitated to engage with her when she first arrived in Willowbrook were now laughing with her, asking for her help, treating her as if she had always been one of them. And then there was Mrs. Pratt. She hadn't just walked away after their conversation. She had stayed. She hadn't participated much, she mostly sat on a bench, watching, but the fact that she was there at all spoke volumes. It wasn't an open acceptance. But it was something. That evening, after the last of the tables had been cleared and the vendors had packed up, Michelle stood in the empty school courtyard, letting exhaustion settle into her bones. Daniel walked up beside her, hands in his pockets. "You did it," he said with a smile. Michelle let out a breath. "We did it." Daniel nudged her shoulder. "You know, I think even Mrs. Pratt was impressed." Michelle let out a dry laugh. "I wouldn't go that far." "Come on," Daniel smirked. The woman sat at that bench for 3 hours. She didn't call the police. She didn't scowl the whole time. That's basically a standing ovation from her. Michelle shook her head, grinning. "Maybe." Daniel's expression softened. "You changed something today." Michelle didn't answer right away. Because she could feel it. Something had shifted. It wasn't just about the carnival. It wasn't just about winning over a few hesitant neighbors. The invisible lines that had separated them were blurring. And even if Karen and Rebecca were still clinging to their old ways, the town was changing around them. Michelle turned to her husband, meeting his gaze. "Yeah," she said softly. I think I did. Would you like any changes before I continue with Chapter 13? A week after the spring carnival, life in Willowbrook had changed. Not in a dramatic, earth-shattering way, but in small, noticeable ways. Neighbors who once only offered brief nods now stopped for real conversations. Parents who had been hesitant at the PTA meetings now openly invited Michelle to coffee. Even at school drop-offs, teachers greeted her with more familiarity. The walls that had once kept the Carters at a distance were slowly coming down. One morning, as Michelle was tending to the flower beds in front of the house, she heard the familiar shuffle of slow, deliberate footsteps. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Mrs. Pratt. The older woman stopped at the edge of the walkway, watching as Michelle pulled weeds from the soil. "You plant those yourself?" Mrs. Pratt asked, her voice as crisp as ever. Michelle sat back on her heels and wiped her hands. "Yep," Mrs. Pratt hummed. "They look decent." Michelle bit back a smile. For Mrs. Pratt, that was practically a compliment. She stood, dusting off her hands. "Need something, Mrs. Pratt?" Mrs. Pratt pursed her lips. "I suppose not." But she didn't walk away. She lingered. And then, after a long pause, she finally spoke again. "I suppose I should have handled things differently when you first moved in." Michelle stilled. That was as close to an apology as she was ever going to get. Instead of calling it out, Michelle let it sit. "Maybe," she said casually, "but I think we're past that now." Mrs. Pratt gave a small, reluctant nod. "Perhaps we are." Then, without another word, she turned and shuffled back toward her house. Michelle watched her go, shaking her head with a small laugh. Progress. Later that afternoon, Michelle received a text from Linda Patterson. "Linda, hey! PTA meeting tomorrow, want to grab coffee after?" Michelle smiled at her phone. A few months ago, an invitation like this wouldn't have happened. Now, it was normal. She texted back. "Michelle, would love to. See you there." That evening, she and Daniel sat on the porch, watching Jordan race up and down the sidewalk with his friends. Ava sat on the steps, her earbuds in, but this time, she wasn't isolating herself. She was watching. Engaging. Smiling at something one of the younger kids did. It wasn't just Michelle who had noticed the shift. Her whole family had. Daniel wrapped an arm around Michelle's shoulders, pulling her close. "You happy?" he asked softly. Michelle exhaled, resting her head against him. Yeah, they had fought for their place in this town. And now, finally, they weren't just existing in Willowbrook. They were part of it. A month after the spring carnival, Willowbrook felt different. Not perfect. Not magically transformed. But changed. The neighborhood that had once felt watchful and hesitant now felt familiar. The cautious greetings had turned into warm hellos. The reluctant nods had become friendly conversations. And the once invisible divide between the Carters and the rest of Willowbrook had begun to fade. One Saturday morning, as Michelle was pouring herself a second cup of coffee, she heard the sound of a knock at the door. When she opened it, she blinked in surprise. Mrs. Pratt stood there, her posture stiff as ever, but something in her expression was different. She held out a plate of cookies. Michelle raised an eyebrow. "You bake?" Mrs. Pratt scoffed. "No. Linda made them. Said I should bring them over." Michelle smirked, crossing her arms. "And did you agree?" Mrs. Pratt gave a huff. "Obviously." Michelle bit back a laugh. She took the plate, lifting the foil. "What kind?" "Chocolate chip," Mrs. Pratt muttered. Then, after a beat, she added, "I suppose you've done all right here." Michelle tilted her head. "Is that your way of saying I belong?" Mrs. Pratt grumbled something under her breath before turning to leave. Michelle called after her. "You know," she said with a grin, "you could just admit you like us now." Mrs. Pratt didn't stop walking. But just before she reached her porch, she waved a hand dismissively. A small gesture. But a big moment. Michelle smiled to herself, shaking her head. Progress. That evening, the Carters sat on their porch, watching the kids race their bikes down the street. Ava was laughing with a group of new friends. Jordan was chasing his best friend, Benji. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hand resting over Michelle's. "This feels different," he said. Michelle nodded. "It does?" For the first time since they had moved to Willowbrook, Michelle wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She wasn't fighting to be accepted. She wasn't proving she belonged. She just did. And that was the real victory. Because true belonging isn't something you're given. It's something you claim. And the Carters had claimed Willowbrook as their own. For good.